Welcome to the 30-day novel NaNoWriMo series. Today is day 28. My name is Lynn Johnston, and I blog at writesmarternotharder.com. So, what makes a good climax? Here are some of the things that make a climax feel really satisfying to the reader. Victory is earned with sacrifice. It feels hard-won. The protagonist didn't just get what they wanted really quickly. It wasn't like a single punch to the face. It wasn't a single joust. It wasn't a 3-minute battle that was like over quickly, that didn't involve losing anything, that didn't involve taking any injuries, that didn't involve taking on any burdens. Victory has to be something that the protagonist sacrifices to get in order to feel really satisfying. Also, the protagonist wins through his or her own efforts and behaves honorably. The protagonist is not stooping to the antagonist level, even though he or she might be tempted. And in fact, that temptation might be your character's dilemma at the climax. That might be the thing that shows the protagonist's growth arc and how much they've grown over the story, is that they have a chance to do something that would basically be cheating. It would involve compromising their principles. For example, if your antagonist says, basically, tell you what, I will give you the castle if you will kill your best friend. If the protagonist kills his best friend and gets the castle that way, that's not very satisfying. We want to see the protagonist get the castle without killing his best friend. So another thing that makes a climax good is having some twists and turns that keep the reader guessing. And this can be very small. It doesn't have to be like an earth-shattering twist. It can just be basically the protagonist temporarily getting the upper hand, and then it turns and the antagonist has the upper hand, and then the antagonist makes a mistake and it turns again. The protagonist has an opportunity to make a little progress. Basically having the struggle be something where the power is moving back and forth between protagonist and antagonist. Your protagonist might have to try multiple things in order to win. And that's going to create some ups and downs for the battle between the protagonist and antagonist. And finally, another thing that makes a really good climax is the stakes are as high as they can possibly be for the story that you're trying to tell. If it's a thriller, the protagonist stakes might be literally saving the entire world from a horrible plague or some sort of environmental catastrophe. It might be that the protagonist is saving a city. It might be that your protagonist is just saving their best friend. It might be that your protagonist is just basically saving their own soul, basically by making the right choice instead of the wrong choice, and reinforcing that growth that they've made throughout the entire story. So when you're talking about high stakes, it's always in the context of what is important to your protagonist and what your protagonist's world is set up to be. So let's talk about how you're going to move your story forward today. Today, the final showdown begins. In yesterday's scenes, your protagonist was separated from his or her allies and is on their own. It's just the protagonist and the antagonist. And if you happen to have a story where you have multiple characters serving as the protagonist, then it's just those characters getting separated from their allies. If you're writing an episode of the Power Rangers, all 5 of the Power Rangers are the protagonist. They function as a protagonist in the story. So if you have multiple characters who are serving as a protagonist, it's not one person versus one person. It might be five people versus the antagonist, or it might be 5 people versus 5 people if you've got 5 people serving in the antagonist role of your story. But basically, the only people who are involved in this showdown are those principal characters who played the antagonist and the protagonist roles in your book. And this is the battle that was foreshadowed from the very beginning of your story. Perhaps the reader didn't recognize it, perhaps the characters didn't recognize it, but when your story began and things started getting disrupted in your protagonist's life, the protagonist ever since then has been moving, whether consciously or unconsciously, toward this final showdown. And at the start of it, the antagonist seems to have the upper hand, because the antagonist was successful yesterday in separating the protagonist from his or her allies and putting the protagonist at a disadvantage. So for your protagonist, how is your protagonist defending himself or herself against the antagonist who now has the advantage, or maybe multiple advantages? What is it going to cost your protagonist to keep fighting? Physically, mentally, emotionally? What injuries and losses has your protagonist suffered just to get to this fight? And how are those injuries and losses affecting him or her? You don't want your protagonist to be heading into this final showdown fresh as a daisy and totally optimistic. This is a point where your protagonist has just seen the potential for defeat in an ultimate final showdown sort of way. Your protagonist has lost some people. Your protagonist has disadvantages they have to overcome. Your protagonist might be looking at their own mortality right now. This is kind of a dark moment. It's not dark in the same way that the story's dark moment is, but things should be a little bit grim for your protagonist here. This is where your protagonist suddenly realized how outmatched they really are. They realize that they are not going to be able to draw on a lot of the resources they thought they were going to have, and they realize just how good the antagonist is. And again, this is another point in the story where in bad fiction and bad movies, the antagonist will gloat and reveal their plan, including the thing that the protagonist uses to defeat them. And I just want to say, if you need your antagonist to reveal something that the protagonist is going to use to defeat them, you want to try and do it in a subtle way. Do it in a way where maybe that information is not coming in the form of a gloat. Maybe it's something that the antagonist admits by slipping in a conversation with the protagonist. Maybe the protagonist manages to anger them enough that they just happen to mention the shark that they've got in the tank below the platform that the protagonist is standing on. So in bad fiction, often it's just delivered as on-the-nose dialogue. But if there's information your protagonist is going to get from the protagonist and use against them, see if you can find a way for them to be having a conversation that is not focused on the antagonist telling the protagonist what he's going to do to him. Try and have that conversation be about their personal conflict. Remember, you want the protagonist and the antagonist to have had some sort of a personal relationship, maybe a grudge. Maybe there's a grudge there, or maybe the protagonist and antagonist used to be friends, and this is where the protagonist is just trying to finally, as a last-ditch effort, say, hey, you used to be a good person. Come back to the light side. You don't have to do this. Or whatever it is that your protagonist and the antagonist, whatever their issue is, this is the protagonist's last opportunity to work it out. And in some stories, the protagonist will not be trying to save the antagonist, and that's fine. If your protagonist is going up against an evil wizard who's clearly insane, there's no point in him trying to convince that guy to come over to the light side. He might try and trick him, or he might argue with him, or he might have some other sort of verbal confrontation, but some people are savable and some people are not, and you have to know which is which in your story world, and I'm sure you do. So anyway, whatever it is that is happening right now between your protagonist and your antagonist, focus on their interpersonal conflict, and keep it subtle. Don't have it necessarily just be like an on-the-nose run of dialogue where each one of them says why they have a problem with the other. Think about how real people fight and argue. Sometimes things get brought up that seem irrelevant, but they're actually the one person trying to communicate to another person like some deeply submerged resentment that never got dealt with, or some sort of problem that that maybe both people are scared to speak about directly, but they both are kind of fighting around it. Looking at your other characters, they're not playing a major role in the showdown between the protagonist and the antagonist. But just be aware of what they're doing. Are they watching? Are they dead? Are they still fighting somewhere else? Is one of them a prisoner? Is one of them suspended over the tank with a shark? Whatever's going on, you may be using those secondary characters as pawns. The antagonist may be using them as leverage to get the protagonist to back down or to create another problem for the antagonist. They may be taunting. Maybe one of the secondary characters is there solely for the sake of having let the protagonist know that he's been betrayed. So whatever your other characters are doing right now, you should know what it is, but also it should be a minor role, and the impact it should have on the protagonist should be secondary. The main problem that the protagonist is dealing with right now should be something that the antagonist is doing. So looking at your conflict, what do the protagonist and antagonist fight about? Are they using weapons? Are they using magic? Are they fighting with their bare hands? Are they fighting solely with words? Is the protagonist completely disabled? Maybe he's tied up over the shark tank. Who knows? But also ask yourself, what remaining surprises do the protagonist and antagonist have up their sleeves? Your protagonist is smart and tough and clever and determined. Probably your protagonist has prepared for a worst case scenario, and this is where whatever that plan is, it comes out. Your antagonist should also be smart and determined and tough and clever and have thought ahead and have surprises that they can reveal that are basically things that they've set up to give them the upper hand or to deal with the protagonist figuring things out. You want to ask yourself, what is your protagonist's greatest hope and greatest fear about the outcome of this battle? This is the most meaningful thing that has ever happened to your protagonist in their recent past. Maybe they've got a deep buried trauma that they're dealing with that happened years ago. But this right now, this is the most important event that has happened to your protagonist since the story started. So setting up your protagonist's emotional involvement in this battle that has just started between the antagonist and the protagonist is a way of engaging your reader more deeply in the conflict. Also, you can ask yourself, how does the antagonist use the protagonist's hopes and fears against them? If the antagonist knows that the protagonist's biggest dream is to marry the contagonist, the antagonist can torture her or suspend her over the shark tank or pretend that she's dead and say, haha, I already killed her, even though he didn't. Or bring her out at the last minute and say, I'm going to make you watch while I kill her, or I'm going to make her kill you. Whatever it is that the antagonist knows that the protagonist wants, both their hopes and their fears, the antagonist should be trying to use that against them. And the reason that you do this is because, again, it creates a greater emotional urgency, which creates greater reader engagement at the emotional level in the outcome of the conflict. So looking at your setting, how are your protagonist and your antagonist trying to use setting elements to their advantage? At this point, again, we talked about the antagonist probably being on home ground or having turned the protagonist's home ground into something that's more advantageous to the antagonist's forces. So, what's in there that your protagonist could use to fight? What is your antagonist taking advantage of? And also, are there setting elements that both the protagonist and the antagonist are struggling with? Are they in an underground cavern that's being split by a river? They're both going to have to be careful not to get carried away by the current of the river, so they're probably going to try and stay out of the water when they fight. Are they in a field full of sinkholes? They both probably don't want to fall in the sinkhole. Is it a thunderstorm? Probably neither one of them wants to get struck by thunder. By lightning. They're both probably trying not to slip. one of them is probably trying to avoid the muddy spot that the other one is trying to shove him into. So look at your setting. How can it be used against each of the characters, and how can each of the characters take advantage of it? And of course, this is always a source of conflict. It's harder to fight uphill than downhill. Put your protagonist downhill and let him have to fight uphill against your antagonist. Looking at your story promises. Again, if you didn't do that day 26 exercise, I recommend doing it, where you look at your story threads and make sure that you've tied everything up in a satisfying way. Or if you haven't, that you're doing it, you probably wouldn't have done it by day 27, but there could be some story threads that could get tied up here in day 28. Maybe there's an outstanding conflict between the protagonist and one of the allies that he or she has lost, and he finally manages to strike a blow on behalf of that ally, and he feels like his debt is fulfilled. Whatever it is you've been promising to the reader all along about how the story is going to end, it should be happening right now. This is like the big story promise fulfillment scene today and tomorrow. So do your pre-writing ritual, do your warm-up exercise, reread what you read yesterday if that helps you get into it. Don't edit, keep writing. Also, I want to say once again, don't let your protagonist win too quickly. Let your very worthy and powerful antagonist throw everything at your protagonist. And every time the protagonist has an obstacle they have to overcome, fully dramatize each of those struggles. And it might seem like when you're writing and you're in a hurry to get to the end, it might seem like, oh, well, slipping and hitting his head on a rock gave him a concussion. Not that important. It's like, that just needs a paragraph. No, that concussion needs to carry through the rest of the climax. And we need to see the protagonist struggling with it throughout the rest of the fight. And that's going to add extra obstacles to the fight. If your protagonist has double vision and is dizzy and is trying not to throw up, or maybe is throwing up, that makes it harder to defeat somebody who does not have a concussion. So think about not just the one big struggle, but think about all the other little obstacles that the protagonist is overcoming. A slippery boulder, a concussion, getting disarmed and having to run for a sword, whatever it is, whatever obstacles you're throwing your protagonist, let each obstacle and the struggle to overcome it be fully dramatized so that we see how hard it is for your protagonist to win. After you write, always celebrate your progress. You are so close. You have done a fantastic job. You're doing something amazing. If you finish 50,000 words and have a complete story in 3 days, you have done something that many, many, many people wish they could do. So congratulations. Always prepare for tomorrow, whatever you need to do to get all your ducks in a row so that tomorrow you can just sit down and write. Do that today. Thanks for stopping by. Happy writing today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.